Okay, welcome students. In this video we're going to look at how to algebraically combine two functions. So I have two functions here. F of x is the square root of x and g of x is equal to x over x plus 1. And what we are going to do is we're going to find the functions f plus g, f minus g, f times g, and f divided by g. Okay, now these ones are maybe a little more complicated than the ones you have in the homework, so hopefully it'll be kind of helpful that way. Okay, now basically what f plus g is defined to be is it is literally what it looks like. It's a new function and it's just adding the two old functions together. Okay, so that's that's what we're doing in this section, is just combining two other functions to get a new function. And so for f plus g, we literally just add these two together. Okay, so we do square root of x, that's f, plus g is x over x plus 1. Okay, this gives us a new function now. Okay, and it is just the sum of the two other functions. Okay, so that's not too bad. It's pretty easy. Let's go ahead and find the domain on this bad boy, because I think on the homework you're also going to need to find the domain. So remember, the domain of a function are the x values for it that you can plug in and actually have it make sense and work. Okay, so if you look at your function here, the different pieces inside, you can think of what can go wrong in that function. Well, first there's a square root. Okay, is there anything we can't take square roots of? Well, negative numbers. Okay, so this guy right here can't be negative, so the x cannot be negative. Okay, so that's one thing. We already know on our number line the x values are going to have to be either 0 or above, okay, in order for this to work. Okay, so we're only going to take things that are 0 or above. Okay, now we look at this other part of it. We're adding to it a fraction. Okay, and maybe I should have done a different one, but oh well, this is fine. What can go wrong with fractions? Well, you cannot have this bottom part be 0. Okay, so this cannot be 0, the x plus 1 right there. So where does that equal 0? It equals 0 at negative 1. Okay, so x equals negative 1 gives you 0 in the bottom, and we cannot have that. So we have to avoid negative 1 as well. Now, if you notice, negative 1 is over here. So we are already avoiding it by going above 0. If this was a number that was like, I don't know, like 2 or 3 or something, that would put a hole in our domain over here, and then we'd kind of have two separate intervals for our answer. Okay, so our domain on this one, where we're already avoiding negative 1 here, and by being bigger than 0, it's just all the numbers bigger than or equal to 0. Okay, so we'd go 0. We want to include 0 because we can take the square root of 0 all the way up to infinity. Okay, that would be the domain of that guy. Okay, let's go back and do the same thing for subtraction, multiplication, and division. Okay, so subtraction is going to be the same sort of thing that we just did. Okay, only instead of adding, we're going to subtract, as you might expect. If I can fit this over here. Okay, so just subtract the two functions from each other. What is the domain of this function going to be? The subtraction? Well, it turns out it's going to be exactly the same as what we just found, right? We still cannot have a negative, right? Because that would take a square root of a negative. We still can't have -1 because that's in the denominator. Really, not a whole lot has changed in that function. So our domain is 0 to infinity. Okay. Awesome. Okay. Let's try a product now. So f times g of x, not to be confused with composition. We just times those two together. So square root of x times x over x plus 1. Okay? And they would probably write that a little differently. They'd probably times these two together. Notice this you could rewrite as a fraction over 1, the square root of x. And so you just times this guy with the top, and the bottom has a 1 on it, so it keeps everything the same. They'd probably write it like this: the square root of x times x, or they may even switch the order on those ones. It doesn't really matter. Over x plus 1. Okay. So that's that function. Now the domain on that guy, again, we can't have negatives because that will make the square root not make sense. And again, we can't have -1 on the bottom because that'll make the denominator 0. But there's really nothing else too big that's happening there. So the domain is the same as the other one. Okay. Lastly, let's do a quotient. So f divided by g of x is equal to, just do a division of the two functions. So f is square root of x divided by x over x plus 1. Now notice with this, we're dividing a function here divided by a fraction. So what we're going to have to do here is just flip this fraction around and times, right? How do we divide a fraction? Well, we keep change flip, right? So we keep this the same and then flip this one and times. So we get x, square root of x times x plus 1 over x. And so we end up getting this guy, square root of x times x plus 1 over x. Okay. Now the ones on the homework I don't think will be this nasty. Is there anything that can go wrong here? Well, we look at this. We still can't have negatives in our answer, okay, because we can't take the square root of a negative. Now let's look at the denominator of our fraction here. Notice there's an x in the bottom now, right? So we can't have 0. We have to avoid 0. Otherwise, if we plug in 0, we get 0 in the denominator. That doesn't make sense. So the domain is very similar to what it was before. It has to be bigger than 0, but not equal to 0. So we just have parentheses from 0 to infinity. Okay, and that would be our domain there. So hopefully that kind of helps you get an idea of how to algebraically combine two functions. You can add, subtract, multiply, divide, and then domain is just figuring out what x values you can plug in. Fractions and square roots are what can throw it off. So you have to, for square roots, avoid places where the square root will be negative. And for fractions, you have to avoid dividing by 0. Okay. Now, if there's no fractions or square roots in your function, the domain is probably everything. And so that will be just fine. Sorry this keeps flickering, by the way. Anyway, I will see you in the next video. Hopefully that helps with that.